What would you do if the person who swore loyalty to you walked away without hesitation, convinced you were no longer enough? Lawrence Chestnut didn't argue when Deborah asked for a divorce. He didn't beg. He didn't remind her of the years he stood beside her. He listened as she explained that she was leaving him for her boss, someone with influence, ambition, and a future she believed Lawrence could never offer. Her certainty was sharp. Final. To Deborah, this wasn't betrayal. It was an upgrade. 7 days later, while she was celebrating her new life, Lawrence received a call tied to a family name he hadn't leaned on, and a legacy he was never meant to inherit until he'd proven something far more valuable than success. Deborah thought she left a man behind. What she never considered was that timing can change everything, and that walking away too early can cost more than staying ever would. Before we continue this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Kindly click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To most people, Lawrence Chestnut had always been easy to overlook. He wasn't loud, flashy, or constantly announcing his ambitions. He showed up, did his work well, paid his bills on time, and kept his word, things that used to matter more than they seem to now. In a world obsessed with momentum and appearances, Lawrence was labeled something far less flattering: safe, dependable, predictable, and eventually, stagnant. Deborah was the first to say it out loud, though she didn't use the word at first. She framed it carefully, as if she were sparing him. She told friends that Lawrence had stopped growing, that he was comfortable being ordinary while she wanted more. In her version of the story, the marriage hadn't failed because of betrayal, but because of imbalance. She was evolving. He was standing still. The narrative spread quickly. People nodded when she spoke, recognizing the familiar language of self-reinvention. Ambition sounded noble when spoken confidently enough. Soon, Lawrence wasn't the loyal husband who had supported her through career changes and long nights, he was the man who held her back. The man she outgrew. Lawrence heard the whispers without ever being directly addressed. Conversations would pause when he entered rooms. Old acquaintances offered sympathetic smiles that carried judgment just beneath the surface. Even silence felt loud. It told him what people believed when they thought he couldn't hear. He didn't correct them. At work, he remained the same: quiet, focused, reliable. He didn't broadcast his pain or seek validation. He moved through his days with the same discipline he'd always had, even as the world around him quietly rewrote who he was. The more composed he remained, the more people mistook his restraint for resignation. Deborah, meanwhile, leaned fully into her new story. She spoke openly about choosing herself, about finally aligning with someone who matched her drive. Each word widened the distance between who Lawrence was and who people believed him to be. And as his reputation shrank into something small and unimpressive, Lawrence allowed it. Not because he agreed with it, but because there was a difference between being underestimated and being finished. For a few days after the divorce became official, nothing happened. No dramatic fallout. No sudden clarity. Just routine. Lawrence woke up, went to work, came home, and sat with the quiet he hadn't chosen but now lived inside. Deborah's absence settled into the apartment like an unfinished sentence. Her side of the closet stayed empty. The silence felt permanent. People stopped checking in. The sympathy faded quickly, replaced by distance. It was easier for everyone to believe the story Deborah told, that Lawrence had simply been left behind. Lawrence didn't correct them. He adjusted. He downsized his life without ceremony. Fewer distractions. Fewer explanations. If this was who the world believed he was now, he would learn to carry it. It was in that stillness, when nothing seemed poised to change, that the phone rang. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced and almost easy to ignore. Lawrence was still at his desk, finishing work that no one else wanted to stay late to complete, when his phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. He almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. The voice on the other end was calm, precise, and formal in a way that immediately set the moment apart from the rest of his day. The caller introduced himself as a legal representative speaking on behalf of the Chestnut Family Holdings Group. The name landed heavier than Lawrence expected. It was a name he shared, but one he had never claimed. What followed didn't feel real at first. A privately held technology company. Decades old. Quietly powerful. Built by family members who believed visibility diluted control. Lawrence had been named the primary beneficiary. Sole holder of a controlling stake valued at $345 million. Shares. Voting power. Ownership. Lawrence sat back in his chair, listening without interrupting, the same way he always did when something mattered. He was told this decision had not been sudden. That he had been observed from a distance for years. His work ethic. His restraint. The way he handled responsibility without applause. He hadn't been chosen for his ambition, but for his discipline. There were conditions. The transfer would happen immediately, but quietly. No public filings. No announcements. No changes to his lifestyle that could draw attention. For now, he was to remain exactly who everyone believed him to be. Silent. Unimpressive. Unremarkable. Silence, the lawyer explained, was not a limitation. It was protection. Lawrence agreed without hesitation. When the call ended, nothing around him looked different. The office lights still hummed. Emails still waited to be answered. No one knew that the man they passed in the hallway now held influence over a technology empire shaping markets far beyond that building. That night, Lawrence didn't celebrate. He didn't call anyone. He went home, cooked a simple meal, and sat alone with the weight of what he now carried. For the first time since the divorce, the quiet felt intentional instead of empty. Deborah believed she had left behind a man with no leverage. Lawrence understood something she didn't. Power didn't announce itself. It waited. Deborah adjusted quickly to the story she'd chosen to tell. From the outside, her life looked lighter, louder, and unmistakably upgraded. She appeared at events she'd never been invited to before, photographed beside people whose names carried weight. Her smile was constant, confident, curated. When she spoke about the past, she did it gently, as if she were being generous. She said the marriage had run its course. That she had loved Lawrence once, but love without momentum had started to feel like limitation. People listened. They always did when success spoke first. Lawrence saw it all from a distance. He never commented. Never corrected a single detail. In her retelling, he had become cautious to the point of irrelevance, a man content to remain exactly where he was. Each version of the story smoothed over the years he'd supported her, the risks he'd absorbed so she could chase certainty later. The truth didn't disappear, it was simply replaced. While Deborah's world expanded publicly, Lawrence's grew quieter. He kept the same routines. Same commute. Same unremarkable schedule. To anyone watching, nothing had changed. He became easy to forget, which suited him. Invisibility gave him space. It allowed him to listen, to observe, to learn without being noticed. And beneath that still surface, things were shifting. Emails began arriving from people who didn't know his face but understood his authority. Documents passed through secure channels. Board materials. Product roadmaps. Strategic forecasts. Lawrence read everything slowly, deliberately, absorbing a world that had always existed parallel to his own life. Decisions were being made with his name on them, even if no one associated that name with power yet. Deborah celebrated milestones she believed she'd reached on her own. New opportunities. New access. She spoke of alignment, of finally standing beside someone who matched her ambition. What she didn't see was how much of that forward motion rested on structures she didn't understand, and ownership she had never questioned. Lawrence never smiled when he noticed the overlap. He didn't feel satisfaction or anger. Only clarity. The more the world rewrote who he had been, the easier it became for him to decide who he would be next. And as Deborah stepped further into the spotlight, Lawrence continued to gather something far more durable than attention. He gathered control. The first decision Lawrence made wasn't dramatic. It wasn't public. No one applauded it or even noticed it at first. It came in the form of a quiet signature at the bottom of a document most people would have skimmed past. A strategic adjustment. A reallocation of resources. Necessary, overdue, and entirely within his authority. That was how it began. Once he stepped fully into ownership, the company stopped being an abstract concept and became a living system he could feel shifting under his control. Meetings were scheduled with people who had never bothered to learn his name before. Executives spoke carefully now, measuring their words, sensing the change even if they couldn't yet explain it. Lawrence listened more than he spoke, asking questions that went straight to the structure of things. Who controlled what, where the dependencies lived, and which decisions had been postponed for convenience rather than reason. Small changes traveled fast. A partnership that had been assumed permanent was quietly re-evaluated. A product expansion Deborah's boss had been counting on stalled without explanation. Budgets tightened in places no one expected, while others suddenly found doors opening that had long been closed. Nothing collapsed overnight, but nothing moved the same way anymore either. Lawrence remained invisible in public, but unmistakable behind the scenes. People began to feel his presence without ever seeing him. Conversations shifted. Plans were revised. Confidence softened into caution. There was a new gravity in the room, subtle, controlled, and impossible to ignore. The company wasn't reacting out of fear, it was responding to direction it hadn't had in years. Deborah noticed the effects before she understood the cause. Opportunities that once flowed easily required more approvals. Promises were delayed. Her boss grew quieter, more tense, checking his phone more often, speaking in half-finished thoughts. Something in his world had changed, and for the first time, he didn't control the answer. Lawrence watched all of it with steady focus. He didn't interfere unnecessarily. He didn't personalize the consequences. He simply corrected inefficiencies, enforced standards, and removed assumptions that no longer held up. Authority, he learned, didn't need an announcement. It revealed itself through outcomes. By the time people began asking who was responsible for the shift, the answer no longer mattered. The system had already adjusted. And Lawrence, once dismissed as safe, predictable, and stagnant, had become unavoidable. Not by demanding attention, but by making every decision count. The truth didn't arrive with an announcement. It slipped into Deborah's world the way discomfort usually does, quietly at first, then all at once. It began with a meeting that was supposed to be routine. Contracts already discussed. Terms already agreed upon. She sat beside her boss, confident, familiar with the rhythm of rooms like that. But something was off. The tone had shifted. The smiles didn't linger. Questions were asked that no one had raised before, precise and unsettling in their focus. Names were mentioned. Holdings. Voting rights. Then Lawrence's name surfaced, not as a reference, not as a formality, but as authority. Deborah felt the moment before she understood it. A subtle tightening in her chest. Confusion flickering into disbelief. Someone slid a document across the table, and there it was in ink and legal language she couldn't argue with. Ownership. Control. Final say. The man she had left behind wasn't watching from the sidelines. He was sitting above the structure she'd been standing on. Her assumptions collapsed quickly after that. Every memory she'd reframed, every quiet judgment she'd passed, unraveled under the weight of what she now knew. The safe man. The stagnant one. The husband she believed she'd outgrown. None of it held up anymore. She reached out to him that night. Lawrence answered, not because he owed her anything, but because avoidance would have implied uncertainty. His voice was calm, unchanged. She spoke too quickly, searching for explanations, for context, for some bridge back to understanding. She wanted to know when it happened. How long he'd known. Why he hadn't said anything. He didn't give her the answers she was asking for. Lawrence didn't explain himself. He didn't defend his silence or correct her version of the past. He told her what mattered now, what decisions were being made, what boundaries were in place, and where her influence ended. Clear. Professional. Final. There was no anger in his tone. No satisfaction either. Just clarity. For the first time, Deborah understood the cost of underestimating someone who never needed to prove himself. The power she had chased had been standing quietly beside her all along, and she had mistaken restraint for absence. When the call ended, Lawrence didn't sit with regret or triumph. He moved on to the next decision waiting for him. Because the truth had surfaced. And it had changed everything. After the truth settled, the noise around Lawrence faded faster than he expected. There were no victory laps, no public reckoning, no moment where the world paused to acknowledge what he had become. And he didn't need it to. The absence of chaos felt like confirmation. Things were finally aligned the way they should have been all along. Lawrence redefined success quietly. Not as influence over people who once dismissed him, and not as proof delivered to those who had misjudged him. Success became control over his time, his standards, and the direction of the work he now oversaw. He invested in projects that reflected discipline rather than hype, building systems meant to last instead of stories meant to impress. Deborah crossed his mind less often than he thought she would. When she did, it wasn't with bitterness or longing. It was within distance. She belonged to a chapter that had taught him something essential about boundaries, about the danger of confusing loyalty with self-erasure. He didn't reach out again, and he didn't leave doors open that no longer served a purpose. There was no revenge because none was necessary. The imbalance that had once defined their relationship no longer existed. Justice hadn't required force, it had required alignment. The moment Lawrence stopped trying to be understood, everything else fell into place. He surrounded himself with people who valued consistency over performance and substance over status. Meetings became shorter. Decisions became cleaner. The company moved forward with clarity, guided by principles rather than personalities. His presence was no longer questioned because it no longer needed explanation. On some evenings, Lawrence sat alone with the quiet he had once feared. But now it feels different. It wasn't empty. It was space. Space to think long-term. Space to build something that would outlive momentary validation. Space to choose who had access to him and who didn't. He hadn't reclaimed his marriage, and he hadn't tried to. He had reclaimed himself. And as Lawrence looked toward the future, it wasn't with urgency or resentment, but with steady confidence, knowing that what he was building now wasn't a reaction to loss, but a continuation of who he had always been, finally unburdened. Thank you for being here and supporting the journey. Your time means everything. Please subscribe to see more content like this.